Welcome to Module 2, Part A. We've been talking about an introduction to the idea of market dynamism. Well, when you start looking at market dynamism and connecting it to the supply chain, there are some major players. And what I usually call this entire system of market dynamism is something called marketing exosystems. By exosystems, it means they're the dynamic domains that run around all supply chains. So if we look at the order all the way from supplier to manufacturer, and if we go downstream, we know that around each one of these role members, channel roles, we have an entire domain of activity. And in fact, each one has its own technological, economic, legal, and political constraints, ethical constraints. They all embody all those market dynamism factors. Now, if we look at each channel role, we can see that they fit into three major clusters. One is a societal cluster. And by societal cluster, it means that I have to be aware of and constrained by the governance mechanisms within society. The second thing is the industry sector. So within my industry, I have certain regulations, I have certain technologies, I have certain ways of doing things that have become conventions by industry. And we call those industry norms. And at the smallest circle, we have the organization. So you think of the organization, the industry, all working within society. What makes this particularly convoluted is that when we talk about societies, we're often very ethnocentric. Those societies have to connect as we go to more and more markets. So it's not just globalization. The market in Texas is probably a little bit different society-wise in terms of our value systems than parts of California or parts of New York or parts of Boston or the Midwest. At the same time, as we go to other cultures, and we might even talk about the multicultural society like Malaysia, depending if you're in peninsular Malaysia or East Malaysia, there will be significant differences in how you go about the distribution process of goods and services. So marketing and distribution would be linked by the societies or subcultures within each of those marketplaces. Okay? The important thing about this is there's essentially a political economy, and that political economy binds all three of these factors. Now, how does this relate to the notion of managing value chains? Well, there are three ubiquitous exchange governance norms that we talk about and that need to be reviewed in light of market dynamism. The first one is the notion of role integrity. And what we mean by role integrity, we mean the glue that bonds individual channel members together. And we talked about the marriage metaphor before. Well, those things, for instance, in China, guanxi has to do with filial and multi-generational relationships that transcend economic benchmarks. And in fact, you'll often hear, oh, we do business with this supplier because we've been doing business with them for generations, and their family is tied to our family. And you find a lot more of this in the global marketplace than you will in the US, where it tends to be more based on the bottom line. However, multinational corporations have to confront the idea of role integrity and the market dynamism. I think that notion of, I apologize, solidarity is very different as we go from market to market. Role integrity having to do with trust and commitment. The notions of trust and commitment are really culturally bound. They change across different marketplaces. And finally, the notion of mutuality. What are the expected outcomes? The best example I can give you, in a lot of marketplaces, China is a good example. They're less interested in profitability in the Western notion, but they're very interested in how many people you can employ. So if a factory can employ 1,700 Chinese, that may be more important than bottom line profitability results in the short term. It's very much how many people can you employ. And by the way, it's not just an Eastern notion. If you go to very union-heavy portions of Europe, primarily Western Europe, you can see a lot of these same kind of notions involved. There's an interesting article in a recent Wall Street Journal about how Spain, the culture is trying to accommodate its EU membership and new working hours that are more conducive to Northern Europe standards. Well, the whole idea of the siesta is being revolutionized as a social norm in Spain because longer hours, and The article talks about how people are grabbing cat naps wherever they can, whether it's on the bus or some form of public transportation or in between office meetings. The last thing that I want to talk about with those exchange governance norms is how this whole idea of market dynamism plays into customer relationships. I think it has a very, very important role. If you got through Lasseter's perspective of, and it's kind of a 2x2 matrix that talks about commitment to the relationship itself versus commitment to competitive pricing. And I make the argument that that pricing is better assessed via value, because price is not necessarily what you're delivering value. And it's a very perceptual construct. If you think about that, the whole notion of customer relationships is very different. In some cultures, in some marketplaces, the notion of what long-term constitutes as a customer relationship is different than short-term. So the temporal dimension is very different and culturally bound. Second of all, the notion of what a customer is, the definition of a customer. We can see increasingly through the supply chain that different channel role sets, the traditional channel role set, especially as we go downstream to wholesale distributors, all the way down to retailers, the functions they provide are very different. We also have the notion of extramediaries that are mediating relationships even between suppliers and manufacturers. Those extramediaries, and they could be technology companies that are providing platforms for communication between the supplier and manufacturer, they're also part of the customer mix. So we're not just talking about the buyer in this sense, but we're talking about a larger domain, the buyer and those connectivities. There's no way to fully explain this except to think about the notion of a hub and spoke system on a bicycle wheel. If you think about the hub and the spoke, that customer is not just the hub anymore. There's a lot of spokes that come out. And as we have greater and greater convolution or sophistication in the supply chain, we would expect more and more spokes. And the extent to which you fulfill the satisfaction or satisficing of those spokes says a lot about customer relationships.